Good evening, everyone. My name is Jacinta Thompson, and I'm the Executive Director and Events and Exhibitions Producer for the Bob Hawke Prime Ministerial Centre. Can I please ask that people switch their phones to silent before we begin? Thank you. And we are recording. Thank you. So it is my pleasure to welcome you all to the Hawke Centre and the University of South Australia. In doing so, I take this opportunity to acknowledge that the University of South Australia is on the traditional country of the Kaurna people of the Adelaide Plains. We recognise and respect their cultural heritage, beliefs and relationship with the land, and we acknowledge that they are of continuing importance to the Kaurna people living today. Tonight we are joined by human rights and environmental justice activist Dr. Kumi Naidoo and historian of science Professor Naomi Oreskes, who will be in conversation with the Honourable Mike Rann AC. And a very, very warm welcome. Thank you so much for joining us. We are pleased to be presenting tonight's event in partnership with WOMADelaide's Planet Talks, and I would like to thank producer Rob Law. Thank you, Rob, for your ongoing support. The session tonight is being recorded, and this will be available on the Hawke Centre website next week. So I encourage you to bring this to the attention of friends and colleagues who could not join us tonight. We are also live streaming this presentation, and we have an audience at the moment of just over 200, so a very warm welcome to wherever you may be. Thank you. And as I said previously, as we are recording, can I please ask that you switch your phones to silent? I'm going to now hand over to the lovely Mike and Kumi and Naomi, and it's going to be a really wonderful conversation. So thank you very much, and please come and join us on the stage. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Jacinta, and thank you all for being here either in person or online. And also I'd like to recognise that we meet on the traditional lands of the Kaurna people. It's a great pleasure. I had also the privilege yesterday down at WOMADelaide, a very hot day, to listen to Kumi and Naomi in their conversation. So I think you're going to really appreciate their contribution this evening. First of all, with Kumi, it's wrong to describe him as a Greenland jailbird, but we'll get on to that in a minute. Kumi was the executive director, the world head of Greenpeace International for some considerable number of years. He was also executive director of Amnesty International, so he was the global head of Amnesty. He's been a global campaigner for citizen participation. He was arrested for his human rights advocacy during the anti-apartheid movement, and as head of Greenpeace, with his campaigns to stop the Arctic being destroyed by oil companies, was jailed for 4 days in Greenland, and I'm sure that was a very chilling experience. And we're looking forward to his contributions. Professor Naomi Oreskes, Professor of History of Science and also Professor of Earth and Planetary Science at Harvard University in Boston. She's a geologist with a very strong historic relationship with South Australia and indeed with uranium mining in South Australia in the Western mining days. She's an acclaimed author of the brilliant Merchants of Doubt, which drew parallels between the tactics used today by the fossil fuel industry and what was used in the 60s, 70s, 80s, 90s by the tobacco lobby. And I have to say I'm really looking forward to your new book called The Big Myth, which I think has come out in the States and is about to arrive here. Is that
exactly.
Right? So
yes.
I think that we can, you should be asking imprints and other bookshops around town, placing your orders. Now, we're in a perilous situation at the moment. We've got a situation where once in 10-year, once in 50-year, once in 100-year events are coming with increasing frequency. We're seeing our oceans warming, becoming more acidic. We're seeing glaciers receding, Arctic ice melting. We're seeing more droughts and floods and cyclones off the coast of Queensland and northern New South Wales, crop disasters and famines because of climate change. So one of the things I wanted to do, which is a bit unusual, and I'm sure Kumi won't mind, but do you have any questions that you would like to ask the audience?
Yes, I do. So the question is, where are we as humanity in addressing the challenge of climate change? I'm going to give you three options. Option one is absolutely no reason to panic. Our political and business leaders will somehow get their act together, and people like Naomi and I and Mike are just drama queens. Not that we have anything against drama queens, who are exaggerating the situation. That's option one. Option two is you believe that actually we are in a deep crisis and things are seriously challenging, and even the window of opportunity is closing, but the window of opportunity is still there, and with human ingenuity and creativity, we can broaden that window of opportunity and shift us away from the suicidal trajectory that we're on. And option three, if I can be permitted to use one of the languages from South Africa, Afrikaans, where I come from, but you'll understand what option three is when I say it. Ons is deep, deep, deep in the kak. Okay? So number one, no reason to panic. Number two, it's serious, but we can reverse things. And number three, it's too late. Okay, those of you think it's number one. No reason to panic. Okay, I just want to give you a reflection. When I was doing this exercise like 10 years ago, there would be about 5% of people would put up their hands. Okay, now it's standard that nobody does. Option two, those of you think the window of opportunity is tight, but we can turn things around.
Oh, we have to vote too? Okay.
Okay, thanks. And option three. Ons is deep, deep, deep in the kak, eh? I could hear an Afrikaans accent there. So, if this is the reality, I want to say to you that, if I can be honest, there are days when I wake up, I'm at number two, and the days where I wake up when I'm at 2.5, and there are days when I wake up. Certainly the day after the last US election, I was definitely number 3. So the sentiment that is there, but maybe I just conclude with saying this. I believe very strongly the moment of history that we find ourselves in, pessimism is a luxury we simply cannot afford. And the pessimism that justifiably emerges from our analysis, our lived experiences, and our observations can, must, and should be responded to by the optimism of our thought, our actions, our creativity, our courage, and our sense of humanity. Thank you.
Thank you, Kumi. Now, Naomi, you're a scientist, and we've been told by the UN, the IPCC, all of these organisations, and by sort of the global climate community, that 1.5% Celsius was the limit that we had to basically keep the lid on, because if we exceeded that limit, we would be in rapidly escalate into catastrophic circumstances. Are we losing that battle? Where are we with the numbers right now?
Well, we are losing the battle, sadly, and I have to say, if I'm being honest, I'm at about 2.75. We are losing the battle in two respects. The first is that the globe hit 1.5 degrees of total warming last year. So we are now moving into the area that scientists have defined as dangerous anthropogenic interference with the climate system. That's precisely the thing that the United Nations Framework Convention on Climate Change was written and signed to prevent. So, to be honest, we have failed at the goal that was set in Rio back in 1992. But in a way, it's actually worse than that. And I feel it's important to talk about how bad it is, not to be depressed, but as a wake-up call and as a galvanizing understanding that scientists have actually underestimated the threat. And about 10 years ago, I wrote a paper saying this, and everyone told me I was being alarmist. But in fact, the whole notion of 1.5 as the threshold where danger began, we now know that that's false. Because across the globe, just this week in Brisbane, but across the globe, we have already seen people being hurt, people being killed, people losing their homes, devastating wildfires affecting both rich and poor around the globe. So the danger, the damage is already well underway. And I think historians will look back and say that actually we already were moving into the danger point around 1 degree. So I think we know that scientists have actually been cautious. They've been the opposite of alarmist, and we are now seeing the damage.
So if 1.5 we broke through last year, we've also had last year every single month broke the previous world record for average temperature. That is still happening. If you look at the current acceleration rate, can you give us a picture about what 3% or 4% or 5%?
Yeah, it's not percent.
Like?
This is,
I'm sorry, but
it's degrees, right? So I mean, it's like 50 to 100% of. I mean, it's a lot of the science was based on the idea of doubling carbon dioxide in the atmosphere. So that's 100% increase in carbon dioxide. And right now we are on track to about 3 degrees of warming associated with a potential doubling of CO2. And this is exactly the thing that scientists, were worried about back in 1958 when they first started talking about this. So we are on track to the very thing that scientists desperately have been trying to tell us not to do. And what does that mean? That means, as you said, many of these events that in the past might have been once a decade, once in a century, once in a millennium, will now begin to become the new normal. And one of the things that I get stressed about in the media coverage, we'll have an event like the Brisbane cyclone, and the media will report this as a 1 in 100-year cyclone. And I want to say, hello, no, it isn't. This just happened, and it will happen again, and the same with wildfires. Many of these events that used to be extremely rare are now normal. And in fact, many years ago in California, Arnold Schwarzenegger, who should be more celebrated as a climate hero for what he has done in California, and this was already a decade ago, he said, we no longer have a fire season, we now have fires all the time. And this is true. So what used to be winter, what used to be times that we thought of as being safe, are now no longer safe.
Right. And now, Kumi, I think it was good that you started with both pessimism but a bit of optimism, and I want you to pursue how that might fan out. I mean, what I've found at the moment in the climate area where I work in, an incredible pall of gloom over all of my US friends, and because of the Trump administration and what it's done, basically dismantling the Biden Inflation Reduction Act and a whole range of other environmental initiatives. So there is definitely, internationally, largely, I think, accelerated by the Trump election, and seeing how corporate bodies seem to be falling in line in a craven way, and even other countries. How do you inject, in a realistic way, optimism into your campaign, and perhaps you could explain how that will work, and also in terms of the movement generally?
Thanks, Mike. I think we can't sugarcoat the moment we find ourselves in. None of us actually thought we should be here or thought we would actually be here, right? Especially, some of us who've been around now for decades, right? But I would take some inspiration from Chinese culture here, where the symbol for crisis is the same symbol for opportunity. In every crisis, we have to now mobilize the creativity to see what the opportunity. But you have to do it in a realistic way. Otherwise, people are not going to follow us, right? And so if you think what Trump does for us, Trump actually sharpens the contradictions. And actually the last week has been very interesting. Elon Musk has been getting kicked left, right, and center by ordinary people in terms of his alliance with fascism and supporting Trump in a slavish way. It's nothing that threatens the Trump presidency right now, but what I am seeing already in the United States is a growing mobilization on a scale that we did not see before the elections. And let's be very, very clear, and if I can just bring Australia into it a little bit, right? Assuming Kamala Harris won the presidency, was it going to be that great on climate? It wasn't going to be. Because basically, if you want to be blunt about it, what we have with Trump is you've got an illiberal oligarchy in place. With the Democrats, when they are there, you got a liberal oligarchy in place. That's the only difference, right? And and maybe I'm jumping a bit ahead here, but when I look at the Australia, you got the same problem with your two major parties, right? I'll give you a quick example. In 2015, when the Australian government at the national level and the Queensland government at the state level were moving ahead with the Adani Carmichael coal mine, a coalition of organizations mobilized, and we realized that we were not strong enough to take on the government or to take on Adani or to take on the Indian government that was a big part of it, because the coal was meant to go to India over the Great Barrier Reef and so on. So what we did was we followed the money, right? And there were protests against banks all across Australia. The 4 major banks were protested against. And my colleague David Ritter, who was the head of Greenpeace here, he says to me, Kumi, can you please record me a video, right, which says these words? And the video was, hello people in Australia, I'm very much looking forward to come and visit with you all, and particularly I'm keen to come and speak with the bank CEOs of the 4 prominent banks to encourage them not to fund the death of our children and their children. And then when I arrive at the airport, David has a huge smile on his face, and I say, something good has happened. He said, the 4 banks just called us in, they've got us to sign NDAs, we can't say anything about it, but all 4 of them have agreed not to fund that project. So the money is not coming from Australian banks, and internationally But then when I go to Queensland, and I meet with the Labour Party who was in power at that point, there was absolutely no difference if I was speaking to the Republican Party in the US from what I was hearing from the Queensland, all the same arguments and so on. So let me just end by saying this. If you came home one day from work and you found that you left the tap open in your bath when you went to work, not fully this thing, but it was open sufficiently. So by the time you come home, the bath is full, the water is on the floor. What do you do first? Do you take a rag and start wiping the water that's on the floor, or do you switch the tap that is causing the bloody problem? And the problem we have here is almost 30 years of negotiations. And the main problem that we face is the burning of fossil fuels. So let's be very clear. What causes climate change? 85% of it is our addiction to oil, coal, and gas. But imagine this. It took us 28 years for fossil fuels to even be mentioned in an outcome document of the climate COP. That's as absurd as Alcoholics Anonymous having 28 years of conferences and 2 weeks long each time. And after 28 years, they have an outcome document that mentions alcohol. And the reason for that, if I can stay with the Alcoholics Anonymous analogy, is because the largest delegation to every year's climate negotiations, not the United States, it's not European Union, it's the alcohol lobby, it's the fossil fuel lobbyists. You know, that's like Alcoholics Anonymous having a conference and the largest delegation to it is the alcohol industry. So the optimism has to come also from what we're seeing amongst young people. Young people recognize, in a way our generation, I think, didn't, that what is at stake is their very futures. And you are seeing a kind of mobilization that I think we need to create more and more space for young people to move forward. And so therefore, I have recently, well, not that recently now, 6 months ago, accepted the role of president of the Fossil Fuel Non-Proliferation Treaty Initiative. We are drawing on the same inspiration of the Nuclear Non-Proliferation Treaty. And the main example that I'm going to focus on is the landmine treaty. So those of you who followed the landmine treaty, what you had was you got the most ambitious countries, the forward-thinking countries, about 40 of them to come together. They negotiated the treaty outside of the UN system, took it into the UN system, and now we have a landmine treaty. Skeptics amongst you will say, justifiably, but US, China, and Russia did not sign the treaty. But if you go look, even though they didn't sign the treaty, the manufacture, distribution, and deployment of landmines completely came to a virtual standstill. Only when Russia invaded Ukraine, we see a little bit of a resurgence. So that's where we are going. We have to get governments to come around the table and agree that, one, no new future fresh investments in fossil fuels. Two, the fastest possible phase out from fossil fuels that takes into account the impact on workers, the communities, and so on. And thirdly, to do it in a way that it's a fair and just and inclusive transition. That's the only option we have going forward. It's not a walk in the park, but I believe with political will, with creative mobilization and so on, we can turn things around and get that treaty done. And if Australia is to hold the COP next year, we want the negotiations to start before that COP start, in the first quarter of next year. We already have 16 nations on board, including 2 fossil fuel exporting nations, Colombia and Timor-Leste, and it's being driven by Pacific small island states who make up that 16 countries. Thank you.
Thanks, Kumi. Maybe, Naomi, if you could follow up with that, but also, I mean, Australia is one of the world's biggest exporters of fossil fuels. So even, you know, with actions occurring in terms of the rollout of renewables, if we just look at what our role is internationally, I think we're the 3rd biggest exporter of fossil fuels. First of all, the gas industry seems to be trying to sell it. We used to have people telling us about clean coal. I remember when I first became Premier and we embarked on legislation which was aimed at rolling out renewables, first carbon reduction legislation in Australia. I had a visit from people saying, you don't have to worry, you don't have to do this because we're going to be able to put it all underground. It's going to be carbon sequestration. So maybe if you could just follow up on the pessimism, optimism pivot, but also talk a bit about fossil fuels and the gas phenomenon that we're currently facing.
Yeah, well, I think the best way to think about that is it's gaslighting by the gas industry. So there's a tremendous amount of disinformation, and part of the way it works is to try to persuade us that they're being reasonable and Kumi and I are being unreasonable. So we've been seeing for more than 20 years now very organized campaigns by the gas industry to insist that gas is a clean coal, but it's not. Gas is a fossil fuel, it's methane. It's actually an incredibly powerful greenhouse gas, about 72 times as powerful as carbon dioxide. And also all gas pipelines leak, all drill holes leak. So if anyone tells you, oh, we can make a leak-free system, that's just not true. So, but this has been very effective, and particularly in the United States, again, you were talking about the Democratic Party. I mean, the Democratic Party and even some major environmental groups like the Environmental Defense Fund bought into this idea that gas was clean and that gas would be a transition fuel. and it's not clean, and it hasn't been a transition fuel. In fact, the opposite. We've now locked in a huge amount of infrastructure to gas that is now committed, the United States and also Canada, to decades of continued gas use. And of course, once you build these facilities, then you have these giant sunk costs, which become harder. It's much, much harder to say, oh, stop using this thing you've already built. So that's a really big issue. And then, of course, clean coal is even worse. But, the Obama administration, the Biden administration, clean coal is an oxymoron. Clean coal is worse than safe sex. It's just not a thing, right? But the industry buys compliance, they buy acquiescence, and they do it also in part by co-opting academia. So in the last decade or so, we've seen a lot of money in the United States flowing into universities, my own included, to pay academics to study clean coal, to pay academics to study carbon sequestration, to pay academics to study geoengineering, the idea of putting junk in the atmosphere to block the sun. And none of these are solutions to climate change for the simple reason that Kumi just said. What is the cause of climate change? It's not the sun, right? The cause of climate change is burning fossil fuels that put greenhouse gases in the atmosphere. And if you want to stop climate change, you have to stop the thing that causes it. And that should be obvious, should be a very simple thing, kind of common sense, cause, effect. You don't like the effect, deal with the cause. And yet, we have just seen huge amounts and huge numbers of people going along with this promise that somehow it's a sort of want to have your cake and eat it too, that somehow you could keep using fossil fuels, but somehow make it okay. And obviously, that's just not true.
It started, using your analogy of the tobacco industry, it started to feel like gas was the kind of the vaping tobacco industry.
It was. And in fact, if you think about vaping, this is a really, really important example of how people of goodwill get co-opted, and it's one of the challenges of doing this kind of work. So when the tobacco industry first introduced vaping, they claimed that this was a harm reduction strategy. And the argument is that smoking combustible cigarettes, smoking tobacco, is incredibly harmful. And we've known this for a century, nearly, and the tobacco industry spent decades denying it. But then one day they said, when they could no longer fight that fight anymore, when everyone around the globe knew that smoking was deadly, and it doesn't just cause lung cancer, it causes about 300 different horrible diseases, including pancreatic cancer and blindness. Then the tobacco industry said, but we want to be part of the solution. And so we're going to adopt a harm reduction strategy, which is vaping. Now, anyone who knew anything about the history of the tobacco industry knew, first of all, this was not an industry that you could trust, right? So why would you believe what they were saying when they'd been lying about tobacco for 60 years? But it was incredible how many public health officials went along with this. Oh, and the other thing is, if you just looked at the advertising, so a lot of academics we know live in a bubble, but I would say to my colleagues, look at this magazine, look at this social media campaigns. All of the advertising campaigns showed attractive young people vaping. So what does this tell you? This is not about getting a 65-year-old smoker to quit smoking, right? If this was really about harm reduction, the ad would be, you and me, right? Smoking, looking kind of bad, and say, no, you could quit, but no, it was all attractive, fashionable young people in their Blundstones or whatever. So the advertising campaign made it totally clear what this was about. But lots of public health officials went along with this, accepted the idea that vaping could help people quit, and that therefore the public health community should support it. And many of them did. And now we have epidemics of vaping, and surprise, surprise, vaping's not healthy. And now we have kids addicted to nicotine, which of course, we've always known nicotine was an addictive drug. So again, none of this should be a surprise. So, one of the arguments I want to make, and I'm sure that because all of you are here, none of you would fall for this sort of thing, but we all have friends and families and colleagues who I'm sure you've had the experience when someone says to you, oh, but isn't geoengineering a good idea? Or isn't carbon sequestration a good idea? Or what about nuclear power? And you can understand why people are attracted to these ideas because they seem like solutions without a lot of pain. But the reality is, no pain, no gain. Giving up fossil fuels is going to be painful in some ways, certainly going to be painful for the fossil fuel industry, but that's a pain, in my opinion, that they deserve because they brought this on themselves. But that leads into, of course, the other thing I hope we'll talk about before our time is up, which is the incredible things that you have achieved here, you and your colleagues have achieved here in South Australia that proves we can make this change, we can make this transition, and it doesn't have to be painful.
Thank you, Naomi. And we'll get on to what state governments can do a little bit later. But Kumi, most of the attention seems to be always on what the big nations are doing. So obviously the US, Biden to Trump, China, which China actually in 2023 put in more solar than the whole of the rest of the world did the year before. And there's also about 66% of the world's rollout last year of wind power. The EU, its European Green Deal, pretty fantastic the way, but I'm worried about changes in the European Council with the elections of more conservative governments, whether there'll be an attempt to undermine that, particularly with EV cars coming from, with German power of the German auto industry. But what so much of the world doesn't pay attention to is the global south. So can you talk about what is happening there in terms of an embrace of renewables and what the reaction is from the global south about the problems caused by the global north?
Thanks. So I'll just bring you in with a quick pop quiz again. So what percentage of the world's population do you think lives in the global south? What we used to call third world, developing, poor countries. What percentage of the world's population lives in the global south? 60%? A little bit higher? 70%? Higher? Higher than 70%? Come on. 80%? 88%. Yeah, it's 88%. Right? Both ChatGPT and DeepSeek both agree on this. Think about that, right? The struggle we have in Africa, for example, right, is that how do I stand a chance to shift my government in South Africa and governments on the African continent when the countries that built the economic domination by exploiting fossil fuels, destroying their forests and so on, how do I get them to actually say, we're not going to touch the fossil fuels, we're going to leave the coal in the oil and the oil in the soil or whatever, right? It's very difficult, right? And what's made it worse, Mike, is that after COVID, many countries have been left with massive debt burdens, right? And sadly, we are finding gas reserves and oil reserves not necessarily in easily accessible places. So it's an uphill struggle for us. And I can tell you that one of the things we're paying a big, big price for is the repression that is coming from the fossil fuel companies colluding with our governments. You know the famous case of Shell in Nigeria and people being murdered and so on. So we are seeing a bit of an explosion of that, right? But what is helping on the positive side is that people in the global south, even though they have contributed least to the problem, in aggregate terms over time, we are the ones that are paying the first and most brutal price from climate impacts. I'll just give you an example. My own city, in 2022, April, in 2 days, 400 people were killed as a result of flooding that we had never seen before. And you don't have to be apologetic that you don't know about it. I can guarantee you that all of us around the world know about what happened in Brisbane this week. Right? I guarantee you, people in Africa know what's happened in Brisbane, because we do deal with the problem of a structurally racist or explicitly racist media environment, where the lives of people in the global south, 88% of them, are not valued in the same way. But we got to turn crisis into opportunity, right? And I just want to give a naughty example to make the point, right? So we need to be evolving solutions that give us a double win, right? So I want to give you an example of technology. Technology is frightening and terrifying on the one hand, but it certainly, if used appropriately, can help leapfrog us into solutions. And this is not the best example, but I'm just going to share this. So dealing with the issue of, in Africa and parts of Asia, we have a huge problem with our water sources being impacted on negatively by human waste landing in our water, right? That's the problem. So just before I became the head of Greenpeace, when my environmental knowledge was very, very limited, I found myself as a visiting professor in Uppsala, Sweden. And the guy that was meeting me from the Swedish Foreign Ministry was about half an hour late. And he proceeded to apologize for half an hour for being half an hour late. And to me, from Africa, that was like normal. So then his apology went something like this. He said, you see, we got a problem. I'm on the Uppsala bus management company, and we faced a big problem at our meeting today. I said, what's the problem? He said, well, in Uppsala, we run our buses on human feces. I said, what? He said, yeah, in some places they call it poo, crap, shit, whatever, but it's human feces. I didn't know this was possible at that point, right? I mean, I don't know how many of you know that it's possible, right? Then when I joined Greenpeace, I discovered in Bristol, England, there's a bus called the poo bus, which is also running. So then I find myself addressing the African Union on the 50th anniversary of the African Organization of African Unity, and I said to my leaders there, I said, I refuse to accept that European shit is better than African shit. We just have to get our shit together and turn the crisis of climate change into an opportunity. And if the Global South digs their head in the sand and say, oh, just because the people in the Global North did it, we have the right to do it, it is self-defeating, it's stupid, and our people are dying, and it's irresponsible, unethical, and we will need to resist that. And thankfully, more and more citizens in the Global South are saying to our governments, enough. People are dying now, infrastructure. Naomi's point about the 1.5, we never should have got beyond 1 degree. If we were thoughtful, we should have never got beyond 1 degree, because think about it. If now we are just at 1.5, if we're seeing this level of disaster and extreme climate events all around the world, we are playing political poker with the future of our children and grandchildren. That is what we are doing. And so it's tough. It's going to be really, really tough. The last thing I would say is there's a structure that many of you might not know called the Climate Vulnerable Forum. It's made up of 71 countries. The Secretary General of it is the former head of Maldives, the Prime Minister, Mohamed Nasheed. I went to see him in January in the headquarters in Ghana, in Accra. And that's where I bought this shirt, by the way. And basically, we are having conversations directly with the leaders of the most vulnerable countries in the Global South. And quite frankly, the leadership is not going to come from the places that created the problem. The leaderships are going to come from the places where the impact of the problem has hit most hard. But it's not going to be a walk in the park, because too many of our leaders are bought, they have been bought for by the same fossil fuel companies that has bought the political power in the global north. Yesterday, I was jokingly saying, my last comment, is that, the Iraq war, was called originally, it eventually came to be known as Operation Iraqi Freedom, an illegal war that was fought on false pretenses. You know what it was originally called? Operation Iraqi Liberation. But then somebody said Operation O, Iraqi I, Liberation L. Maybe that's a bad idea to call it, and they changed the L to freedom. So basically, I just would end by saying that sad reality is that future wars will not be fought about oil. Future wars and even current wars are going to be fought about water. And unless we can make the intersections between the different struggles that we face, we're not going to succeed. Then I would say we have been part of the problem, those of us in the climate justice movement. We framed climate change as an environmental issue. That was a disastrous thing for us to have done. We should have framed climate change as a cross-cutting issue. It's about economic transformation, changing our energy system, our transport system, our food system. And so long as we delay embracing the idea that the feminist movement gave us, which is intersectionality and connecting the different struggles, we will fail repeatedly. So we need to turbocharge intersectional thinking and intersectional action if we want to stand a chance to turn things around.
Thank you. Naomi, you mentioned about subnational governments, and it's interesting, an organisation that I chair has 185 state governments, including California, New York, New Jersey, Connecticut, and Washington State and Colorado. A lot, getting back to that point, the attention is often on national governments, but we've got a situation where perhaps between 65 and 75% of the decisions that affect the climate are made by cities, regions, provinces, states. So do you have, given what's happening in the United States, do you have some hope that there will be a continuation, as there was with California's leadership, on the subnational front?
Yeah, I do. And actually, after the election, when a lot of my students were very, very upset, we actually had like a little informal conversation after class. And this is what we talked about. Because I think, particularly in the United States, but in many other countries as well, we've gotten the habit of looking to our federal government to be the main place where problems got solved, and maybe even to some extent to international governance, the COP process, the UN Framework Convention, the United Nations. But the reality, I think, is two things that are grounds for legitimate optimism and not just sugarcoating. One is that in many countries in the world, power is distributed, and particularly in the United States, the states and the cities have tremendous power that I think we haven't really tapped into yet. And if you think about climate change, and Kumi's point, 85% of all greenhouse gases are from burning fossil fuels. Fossil fuels are tied to economic activity and transportation. Most of that takes place in cities. And in America, the cities are almost all progressive. I mean, we talk a lot in the United States about red states and blue states, but it's actually quite misleading, because what we really have are blue cities and red rural areas. And the reality is that, with the few exceptions about some agriculture, the vast majority of the economic activity is in those blue cities. So and those cities have already begun to mobilize, but if they did more, and if they began to build stronger networks of cities and states that are willing to take action, we could have carbon taxes on a statewide level. We can have renewable portfolios, and we already do in some places, and California is the case in point. So California passed its climate legislation, AB 32, 15 years ago now? And it set a target for cutting, it was 30% by 2010?
Yeah, or was it 2015? Yeah.
2015, but in any event, the state surpassed that. And at the time, many people said it was unrealistic. There were even some climate scientists who argued against it. The famous climate scientist and my friend, Steve Schneider, said, it's too ambitious, it's not realistic. If you set the target too high and fail, that's bad. Well, California has exceeded the target substantially and is now on the way to greater emissions cuts. So we know that a lot can happen on the state and city and town level. And often that's also a good thing, because particularly in a big country like the United States, but here in Australia as well. I mean, if you live in Perth, Canberra's awfully far away, both physically and conceptually, and the same is true in the United States. Many Americans feel that Washington, D.C. is just very far away. But if you set your sights on your state capital, well, that's not so far away. And very often it's easier to make contact with your state representatives than your federal representatives. So I'm actually cautiously optimistic that we can have real change in the United States and elsewhere by focusing more on the local level.
Yeah. I mean, that was...
Can I just add to that?
Yeah.
So I fully support all of that. And just to say that we should remind ourselves that local governments, municipalities, and states and provinces are actually more the base units of democracy, right? And if you take Netherlands and the United States as two very different countries, right? You've got governing coalitions at the national level that are completely out of touch with public opinion on the urgency to take climate action. In the United States, we're talking about at least 80% of people recognize that it's a problem and want something done about it. There's very different opinions about what exactly to be done. In the Netherlands, it's even stronger support. So one of the ways strategically the Fossil Fuel Treaty Initiative has been working has been trying to get cities to endorse the treaty and states. So in the US, California has endorsed, Philadelphia and other cities have endorsed. Yes, Sydney has endorsed. So if you're wondering if there's something you can do, then you can get, firstly, Adelaide to endorse, and you get the South Australia as a province to, state to endorse. And think about it, right? If you take the United States, what will happen now? Trump has pulled out of the climate negotiations. But for the 4 years that he was president before, one of the largest delegations to the COP was a coalition of governors of states and mayors of cities with the slogan, "We are still in," and they participated in it, right? So, but if in the United States, just to make the point, if we were able to, as the treaty initiative, get every blue state, democratic state, to endorse, and we get the blue cities in red states like Omaha in Nebraska, for example, to endorse, and you aggregate the number of people that those governing entities actually represent, then you are talking about 60 to 65% potentially. So I offer that as a hopeful strategy because, you know, we talk about the license to operate for companies. You know, we say we need to, if they're doing bad things, we need to look at how we withdraw their license to operate. We need to take that logic now and try to deploy it to our best ability to undermine the license of right-wing, and let's be blunt about it, in some cases overtly fascist governing coalitions, right, to actually make it difficult for them to continue. Again, I'll say it's not going to be easy, but I believe it is possible, and I want to invite each of you to be part of it by every local government where you have a friend, a relative, or an ex-girlfriend, an ex-boyfriend, whatever, contact them and say they should endorse, get their city to endorse, so that if Australia, together with the Pacific, actually does have the COP. And Mike said one of the worst fossil fuel producers. Basically, Australia is the third worst culprit. Russia and Saudi Arabia are the only two countries that export more fossil fuels than Australia does, right? And quite frankly, to be blunt with you, Australia has absolutely no business even trying to hold the COP, really, right? But you can be part of the solution. The fact that it's coming, you have global stage next year. Please make sure that you'll do whatever you can to get every governing entity from the local to the state level to actually endorsed, so that even if whoever gets elected at the national level, they should not be able to get away with it because the voices from below should be strong enough. Thank you.
Thank you, Kumi. Naomi, we're sort of getting close to the end, but you were here in South Australia. You were a geologist, a geological scientist who worked with Western Mining that later on became part of BHP, and you worked on the Olympic Dam uranium, copper, gold, rare earths mine. Now, the reason I'm mentioning this is we're about to have a federal election. It's going to be held in May, we're being told, although it hasn't been called yet. One side of politics, the opposition, is proposing that each state should have a giant nuclear power station. Now, you come out of the nuclear industry in terms of uranium, so I don't know what the response is going to be, but I've got a rough idea. But do you think, is this a smart move?
No, it's not. And one thing that's fun about my own background is I can surprise people with this, there's that, icebreaker you often have in social settings. Tell somebody something surprising about yourself. And I say, well, I used to be a uranium geologist. And that's like, people are always stunned by that. But it also gives you a certain amount of credibility as well, because obviously we need materials, we need mining. None of us could be here today if you rode a bicycle, drove a car, took the tram. None of that would exist without mining. So obviously we need to have materials to live the lives we want to live. But as we move forward in this crucial moment, we need to be asking smart questions about what kinds of technologies serve our needs the best. And the reality about nuclear power, well, there's several realities. I don't want to say it's a failed technology, because that would be a little too strong, but it is a technology that has utterly failed to live up to the promises that were made for it. So some of you may know when the nuclear power was first promoted by the United States in the 1950s, we were promised electricity that would be too cheap to meter, electricity that would be free as the unmetered air. Well, that obviously didn't happen, but not only did that not happen, nuclear power is now the most expensive form of electricity anywhere in the globe. It costs about 3 to 4 times as much to generate a kilowatt of electricity from nuclear as from wind or solar. So there is no economic case for nuclear power. And I'm going to say that again because a lot of the people who promote it are business people who are supposed to care about economics. There is no economic case. And in fact, in a way, it's even worse, because if you ask yourself, where did this technology even come from in the first place? Why do we even have it? It was never a response to demand. It was never a response to market forces. The United States promoted civilian nuclear power as a kind of mea culpa for the bombing of Hiroshima and Nagasaki. And during the Cold War, when the US was fighting for the hearts and minds of the global South and the non-aligned nations, the United States tried to be absolved from guilt for having developed the world's first weapons of mass destruction by saying, well, don't worry, we're the good guys, we're going to turn these swords into plowshares. And so under the Atoms for Peace program, the United States actively promoted nuclear power in America, in Europe, and then in the non-aligned nations like India as well. It has never been cost competitive. There is no country in the world that has consistently got the lion's share of its nuclear power from electricity from nuclear, except for France, which is now backing off. And why is France backing off nuclear power? Because guess what? When it gets too hot, nuclear power doesn't work. And so just 2 summers ago, the French government had to actually shut down some of its nuclear reactors during a heat wave because the reactors became too hot. So how is that a solution to climate change? Obviously, it's not. And there are many more things we could talk about. The huge water demands of nuclear power, the problems of nuclear waste disposal that have still not been resolved, something that we talked about here in Adelaide 40 years ago over on Green Hill Road, and we used to have long discussions after work over beers because we were mining this uranium, but we knew that there was a kind of ethical issue about what was going to happen to the waste. Back in that day, we talked about that Australia should sell the uranium but then take the waste back. Well, obviously that never happened. So it's just an incredibly bad idea on multiple levels, but some people push it. And I think the reason, I've thought a lot about why. Why would anybody, especially a business person, push a technology that is proven not to live up to the hype, too expensive, too demanding of water, dangerous? People don't like it. I mean, is there anything good about this technology? And I think it's the promise of the technological fix. The idea that if we just do this one thing, we don't have to phase out fossil fuels. We don't have to, make different choices. And we can just keep living this life of abundance. And I think that promise, the promise of the electricity too cheap to meter, still is, there's this kind of lure of the technological fix. And, I think it's a huge error. And I don't even think it can really happen. Because if you think about how much it costs to build these plants, how incredibly expensive they are, how much water they need, and finding how long it takes to build, average 10 years to build a nuclear power plant, and finding a suitable site for it. I mean, nobody wants a nuclear power plant in Adelaide or in Perth or in Melbourne or Sydney or Brisbane, but that's where the people are, that's where the power demands are. So you could put it out in the bush, but now you're talking about big high voltage electricity lines. So it's a misguided idea from top to bottom. And I really hope that, again, that this isn't something where we sugarcoat it and say, well, I kind of no, it's a ridiculous idea. And anybody who's involved in it should be willing to say that.
Yeah, and I think the fact that the fossil fuel industry is so supportive of this policy means it's another example of delay.
Exactly.
Because they know it's not going to happen, but they can make hay while the sun isn't shining.
Exactly.
Just to finish up, and I hope you'll take back the message from South Australia, where the current government is aiming to achieve 100% renewable power in the next 3 years.
Wow.
And
Yeah.
that puts South Australia in an international leadership position, and perhaps we need to tell more people about it and use it as an exemplar.
Well, that's what I think, and we talked about this yesterday. I mean, this is such an astonishing accomplishment, and I hope you're justifiably proud of your role in it, because it proves to the world we can generate the electricity we need, we can live a good life, and we don't have to freeze in the dark, and the Global South can do it as well. These technologies, they exist now, we don't have to wait for a miracle, but we have to have the right policies in place to support them, and you've done that here in South Australia. So one of the things I plan to do when I go home is to talk more about this example, because people need to know, because it's really amazing what you've achieved here, and no one outside of Australia knows about it.
Yeah. Kumi, one final word from you.
So I want to say a big thank you to Mike, because he stepped forward, and he was probably dismissed as a crazy, loony person. Might still be, I don't know about that.
Yeah.
But that's what we need in this moment. And also, by the way, he's also one of the founders of Greenpeace New Zealand. And we need to be looking now for sources of inspiration amongst us, right? We cannot be putting our faith into institutions that have failed us far too many times. So we also have to diagnose why is it that it is so difficult for us to communicate the urgency of the biggest challenge that humanity has ever faced, right? And I thought I'd just end on some good news, right? So, we say, people like me, save the planet, save the environment, save the climate. So the good news is, the planet is absolutely fine. The planet actually does not need saving. So think about it. If we continue on this path, we destroy our water, we destroy our soil, it becomes so hot, we cannot plant food. By the way, here in Adelaide yesterday, people's vegetables died. Right? I went to my friend's house and he showed me his plants died because it was so hot. Right? So the end result, if we continue on this path, we will be gone, the planet will still be here. And the good news is, once we become extinct as a species, the forests will grow back, the oceans will recover, and so on, right? So we have to recognize that the struggle to avert catastrophic climate change is about protecting our children and their children's future, right? And all cultures around the world are actually united by, irrespective of religion, irrespective of race, region, indigenous, non-indigenous, we all value our children as the most precious assets that we have. And we need to actually do that in more powerful ways. And in our diagnosis, we should remember what Albert Einstein once cautioned when he said the definition of insanity is doing the same thing over and over again, trying to get different results, okay? And here I want to end with this. The main reason we have been failing in the climate justice efforts across the world for decades now, in my judgment, is that we have been aiming all our messages at the brain, science, degrees, parts per million, policies, and so on, and we've ignored the heart, the body, and the soul. We need to change the way we talk about this crisis, right? And in this, I hate to say it, we can learn a lot from Trump. We don't have to lie like he does, but we don't have to be so bloody boring with the facts. Right?
Speak for yourself.
Well, I said I made the mistake. So I want to end with this message to you, right? There is nothing for us to gain by looking at the dire situation we find ourselves in and feel overwhelmed by it. You have every right to feel overwhelmed. Take a couple of minutes to be overwhelmed and then say, human beings are creative, human beings are talented, human beings have done some incredible things that we never thought as a species we'd be able to do. And apply that creativity, ingenuity, and so on to slowly pull us back from the brink and turn things around so that we can actually ensure that humanity can exist on this planet for centuries and centuries to come. Thank you very much.
Thank you.
Can't wait to be here with you.
Can I just thank Kumi and Naomi, and just say also, Jacinta, how fantastic that the Hawke Centre has hosted this. That one of the last conversations I had with Bob Hawke was about what he was most proud of. I expected him to say Medicare, and I'm sure that was on his list. But he did say to me that the work he did for the treaty to stop mining in the Antarctic was the number one thing he felt most proud of, and the other one was working through the Commonwealth of Nations, taking on Margaret Thatcher and Reagan about apartheid in South Africa and the release of Nelson Mandela. So this is a very appropriate occasion. Thank you for a magnificent discussion. Thank you.
Thank you, Naomi, Kumi, and Mike. Thank you very much for your time and joining us again. If you do want to follow Kumi and Naomi, the links are on our website, so please go back and have a look in there and see the work, and especially Kumi's work that will continue. And Naomi, sorry, when your book again? When is this being launched?
The paperback is supposed to be available in Australia next month. Very soon.
The Big Myth.
The Big Myth. It's called The Big Myth, How American Business Taught Us to Loathe Government and Love the Free Market. It's a lot.
So we may have Naomi back again with us at some point.
That would be
so
good.
Which would be
Thank you.
So, thank you, everyone.
Excellent.